Welcome, everyone. This is Angela Paulino with the McSilver Institute, along with the Community Technical Assistance Center and Managed Care Technical Assistance Center. And I would like to welcome you today to today's webinar, Impact of Intimate Partner Violence on Children and Child Development. The McSilver Institute, CTAC, and MCTAC have partnered to launch this multi-platform online series to help clinical professionals, community health workers, educators, policymakers, and any and all who influence our healthcare system to think critically about those social factors that have a direct and indirect impact on individuals' health and mental health. So before we get started, I'm going to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in today's event. Please note that as you're joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute, and this is to avoid background noises that may distract others from listening to today's presentation. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, make sure that you chat to our host, Brianna, who will be able to assist you. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions during the Q&A portion of today's presentation utilizing the chat box feature, which is located to the right-hand side of your screen. If it is not visible, please click the dialog bubble to the right toolbar and it should appear. In order to make sure that we answer as many questions as time permits, we're requesting that you send in your questions at any point during the webinar, and we'll address them during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. Also, if you have cases that you might want to share or have questions about, make sure that you type them as they come up so that you will have enough time to type them and we will have enough time to address them. Once again, thank you for joining us. We are very excited to have Alejandra Caso, Director of Clinical Programming, and Shoshana Indike-Levy, the Senior Counselor at Steps to End Family Violence, who will be conducting our talk today. So without further ado, we'll have Shoshana and Alejandra.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on the impact of intimate partner violence on child development. My name is Shoshana Levy, and I'm a Senior Counselor at Steps to End Family Violence. For those of you who are not familiar, Steps to End Family Violence, or STEPS as we like to call it, offers a variety of innovative trauma-informed programming focused on the prevention of intimate partner violence, advocacy and healing for survivors and children impacted by abusive partner behavior, as well as training and education intended to increase awareness of the epidemic of gender-based violence. The Community-Based Services Team, CBS, of which I'm a member, provides individual, group, and family counseling to child and adult survivors of domestic violence. I have been on STEPS for just over 2 years, and as a counselor with the CBS team, I have been providing counseling, advocacy, and crisis management services to child and adult survivors of intimate partner violence.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alejandra Caso. I'm the Director of Clinical Programming at Steps to End Family Violence. I've been working at STEPS for 6.5 years. Through my career, I have been able to work providing psychotherapy to children, adults, and teens in Mexico and the U.S. However, since I arrived to New York City 8 years ago, I have specialized in supporting children and adult survivors of trauma, in particular survivors of intimate partner violence, or IPV. For the sake of this webinar, we're going to start referring to intimate partner violence as IPV.
All right, so let's get on into it. So here's a brief overview of the topics that we're going to be covering today. We've already done the introduction, and we'll be moving now into what trauma and IPV looks like for a child. We will then look at the impact of IPV on child development and provide some best practices for working with children impacted by family violence. Next, we will provide a brief introduction to 3 modalities of treatment that we use at STEPS: child-parent psychotherapy, CPP, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT, and non-directive play therapy. We will finish by providing you all with some resources for mental health professionals. This is meant to be a broad introduction to working with child survivors of domestic violence. As with other therapeutic modalities, trauma-focused therapy needs to be tailored to each specific case. We are therefore more than happy to answer more specific questions regarding safety planning, when to include the abusive caregiver, how to include the abusive caregiver during the Q&A portion.
So what is trauma? So let's start with the definition that the DSM-5 provides to us. So trauma is defined as the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in the following ways: directly experiencing the trauma event, witnessing the event, learning that the traumatic event occurred to a family member or close friend, and experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic event. So this is kind of the formal definition of trauma. However, for trauma therapists, it is also very important, and I would say most important, to understand traumatic events as they relate to the impact that they have in the individual. Therefore, Judy German explains that traumatic events take away the sense of control, connection, meaning for an individual, and overwhelm their capacity to adapt to life. And so that's what we want to be looking at, because it is very important to understand that what can be traumatic for one person is not necessarily traumatic for another. So we want to look at the impact, at the consequences of the traumatic event in the person to understand how severely they were impacted by it.
So most of us already understand the basics of IPV. It is actual or threatened physical, sexual, psychological, and economic abuse that impairs the ability of the abused person to function in a self-determining, healthy way. So what does this look like in practice? There is no one example of what DV is, but what is most important is to look at the different patterns of behavior that one partner uses over another to establish and exert power and control. This may be physical violence, sexual violence, emotional, verbal, spiritual abuse or coercion. This can be technological abuse, which is unfortunately becoming more and more common, controlling the family's finances, any or all combination of the above. The important thing to remember is that DV causes one partner to be afraid, one partner to dread coming home. The key here is the power and control. So when talking about childhood trauma, and DV in particular, it's important to realize that this child's entire worldview has been crushed. Children who witness domestic violence between a mother and father, for example, have now seen their father, who is meant to be their protector, their provider, hurt their mother. They have seen their mother, this nurturing, caring, protective figure, being injured and being unsafe. In the child's mind, the question is now, how can these two people protect me? So according to the TFCBT model, the traumatic experience for the child is one of a loss of control, because they've lost control of the situation, a lack of predictability, in this example, not knowing which father is going to be walking in the door, and a sense of chaos in the home. Children who experience complex trauma have had their most intimate relationships disrupted by the experiences of maltreatment, violence, and other forms of trauma. So in this way, there has been a shattering of the child's trust in the safety of attachments, which we will get into a little bit more when we start talking about CPP.
So now let's talk a little bit more about the impact that relational trauma or complex trauma, as we defined it before, has in the development of children. This will allow us to understand the symptoms that a child, survivor, or witness of IPV will most likely have. First of all, trauma is going to disrupt normal development in a child, making it more difficult for the child to achieve age-expected milestones. Basically, typical developmental stages may be experienced in a more intense way, especially in relation to attachment and emotional regulation. So basically what this means is that the mastery of attachment and emotional regulation in an age-appropriate developmental task is going to be compromised. So we are going to look at a video now that is called Toxic Stress. I don't know how to put it. To see a little, to see a little bit about how all this complex trauma is impacting the child at a physical level and in their brain.
Okay. I would like to let the audience know that in order to hear the video, you would need to either use your earphones or computer speakers.
Stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the
Okay, so based on what we just watched and heard, can you think of any symptoms that children might experience as a result of IPV?
You can type an answer into the chat. Let us know.
So some people are talking about anxiety, difficulties at school, nightmares, short temper, bedwetting, PTSD, panic attacks, attachment issues, attention problems. So you guys are really, really good. All of those are symptoms that we were going and are going to mention now. So let's move on. And this is a chart that was developed by the Salt Lake Area Safe at Home Coalition Children's Committee. It's not a complete chart. We summarized it a little bit to talk about the symptoms that for us are the most relevant and pair them to ages of development for a child. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the whole chart, but let's talk a little bit about how trauma and complex trauma and toxic stress can impact babies and infants. So for babies and infants, we can look at higher levels of cortisol, higher startle response, a slower response to stimuli, a delay in development of gross motor skills such as crawling and walking, a low response of effective behavior and effective cues, an insecure attachment, so babies can become clingy or over-attached to strangers. Now for toddlers, some of these things are carried on, of course, because they haven't been solved and they haven't been, the milestones haven't been achieved yet. So for toddlers, what we're going to observe mainly is language delays, regressive behavior, like toilet training, eating or sleeping disturbances, lack of self-regulation, aggressive behavior. So I want to stop in the aggressive behavior symptom a little bit just to explain two things. So two things that can happen when a toddler is displaying aggressive behavior is, the first one is that his language might be delayed, which means that the child is now understanding way more about his world than what he can communicate to the outside. And that comes with a lot of frustration. And that, to a certain degree, is a normal developmental stage for any toddler. However, when the delay in language is significant, the frustration around communication becomes bigger and bigger. And that's where the aggressive behaviors can become stronger. Another reason why we can see aggressive behaviors is because sometimes children that are witnesses or survivors of IPV might develop a coping symptom that we call the identification with the aggressor, which means that a child is seeing, in this case, let's say, for the sake of generalization, mom being hurt and daddy being the one that is hurting her. So in the child's mind, mommy is the one that is the most unsafe and at risk, and daddy is the one that is in control. So what they're going to do is they're going to think, okay, it's safer to be like daddy than to be like mom. That's why they're going to start displaying some aggressive behaviors in order to identify with the aggressor. For these type of problems, it is very important to, when you are in parent support sessions with mom, to make really clear distinctions about what it is the child's personality, because some of the moms would come to therapy and say, my child is just like her or his father, they're going to become abusive. And so it's very important to normalize the experience and to explain to them that this is not the child's personality, that this is the trauma playing a place in the child's development. Okay, let's continue with other symptoms that we might observe in toddlers. We continue observing insecure attachment as well. And then now let's talk about children. Children might present a lower development of independent skills. So in order to feel that they're protected and taken care of, a child might be not really reaching or doing certain things that would show some independency, with the intention that maybe mom or a grown-up that will be there to protect them and care for them can take care of those. The complete other side of this symptom might be the parentification, which can also occur and occurs a lot in children. So the child is very quick to perceive that mommy is not safe, and mommy sometimes is not ready to take care of certain things at home and the child. So the child starts to overfunction and starts to take care of things that an adult should be taking care of, and that's what we call parentification. Other symptoms that we can observe in children are attention seeking, nightmares, headaches, stomach aches, depression, either passive or active. When we think about passive depression is what we commonly think about depression, which is children that are withdrawn, sad, not motivated or interested in anything, crying. But when we think about active depression, we want to think about children that are irritable, grumpy, angry. All of those can be symptoms of depression, that they just look very different. Another symptom that we can see in children that have been impacted by IPV is a decreased feeling recognition and communication, not reaching cognitive and social milestones, having problems with concentration, learning, memory, and this is due to dissociation, and later on I can explain a little bit further about what dissociation is and how it works, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip that one. An increase of aggression because of the identification with the aggressor, an increase of withdrawn, and a low in self-confidence. And finally, when we think about teens, some of these developmental challenges can go all the way to the adolescent time, and what we're going to see is an increase of risk behavior, academic issues, and dating balance issues as well. So that's for the development. Let's move on to the props. The PROPS is a parent form that we use at STEPS in the beginning of treatment, and then we continuously use it every 3 months to monitor the symptoms or the trauma symptoms that a child is presenting. This is a form that is self-reported by the parent, and so we basically ask the parent to think about the past week and their experience of their children in the past week, whether they have observed these behaviors, whether they haven't, or whether they have somewhat observed them. And so we ask them to rank them and to rate them. And then we get a score. One quick thing that I would like to mention about PROP scores is that in the beginning of treatment, you can find that your PROP scores are very, very low, meaning that very little symptoms are reported. And this can be due to the fact that there is little rapport built with the parent or little understanding on how these symptoms are related to the intimate partner violence experience. So as the treatment continues, the parent might feel closer to the therapist and might feel more open to disclose more severe symptoms. And also the parent is going to become more and more aware about, oh, these symptoms that my child is having are actually related to the trauma exposure. So because of that, we can see PROP scores that in the beginning are going to be very low, and then 3 months later are going to start getting higher, and then 6 months later might even get higher. And this is, like, some therapists might feel like, oh, therapy is not working, the kid is actually getting worse. But in reality, what this is showing is that just symptoms are being more up front or in the air. Okay, I think that's that. So let's move on to,
All right, so with all of this information now on the different symptoms, what to look for, how to evaluate, the question now becomes, how do we work with children who are impacted by IPV? The answer, not so differently from the way we treat adult survivors of trauma. Of course, there are variations necessary due to age, but the general principles remain the same. So the first thing is client-centered practice. Probably the biggest buzzword in trauma therapy right now, but it's true. We have to provide choices to survivors, even if they're kids. It can be from the smallest piece of the work, for example, allowing the child to choose board games versus playing with a dollhouse versus coloring during session, to showing the child a book on domestic violence that you would like to read that day, and giving the child a space to say, no, I'm not ready, maybe next week. Next, we must recognize the impact of trauma on development and functioning. So a great example, let's take a look at ADHD. What are some of the diagnosis requirements for ADHD? Inability to pay attention, easily distracted, hyperactive, impulsive. Sounds pretty similar to some of the symptoms that we see in children who have experienced trauma. Now, we're not saying that ADHD is not a real disorder that many children do suffer from, but we are saying that before a diagnosis gets put onto a child, the trauma must be recognized and accounted for. Is this ADHD or is this a trauma symptom? It's also very important to normalize the experience. We have to make sure that the child understands that they are not alone in experiencing domestic violence, others have gone through it, and it is not their fault. And one way to do this is by being open with the child about why they're coming to therapy in the first place. So, for example, at STEPS, in the very first meeting with the child, we'll sit down and ask the child if they know why they're coming to therapy. Some children have no idea, others will be very cute and say, to talk about my feelings. And we say yes and talk a little bit more about it. And we will then go into the idea that the reason that the child is coming to STEPS specifically for treatment is because, for example, they saw their mommy get hurt by someone, and whether this is daddy, a boyfriend, whoever, it can be personalized for the child. We say in that very first meeting, the reason that they are coming to STEPS is because they saw their mommy get hurt, or they saw their daddy get hurt, whoever it is. And as Alejandra mentioned previously, it's also very important to differentiate trauma symptoms from the child's personality. So an example of this might be a case that I had where an elementary school age child was found to be touching his preschool age little brother, in his private areas and was making the preschool child uncomfortable. So we had a long conversation with mom and safety planning and everything that went into that. But one of the most important pieces that we talked about with mom is the fact that no one is labeling her elementary school-age son as being quote-unquote deviant, or that there's something wrong with him, that he is being criminalized in any way, because we knew already that this child had not only witnessed domestic violence, but also been abused himself and had been forced to watch pornography with his father. So because of this trauma history that we had and what we knew, we understood that this was most likely a trauma symptom and not the child's personality. So that was something that we talked at length about and made very clear, and is something that should definitely be kept in mind when working with children who have been impacted by IPV behavior. All right. So once we've recognized the impact of IPV, we have to pay attention to the trauma and the way that the trauma has impacted the attachment relationship between child and caregiver. So we have to note that this is for the child and both caregivers, as the impact has been on the relationship with each. With the non-abusive caregiver, treatment can often be done in tandem, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a few minutes when we go into some of the different modalities. And with the abusive caregiver, the relationship has been shattered, as we've said before. At STEPS, we personally do not work with the abusive parent just because of our space, training, and resources. However, there are some organizations who do, and what is necessary for family therapy, including the abuser, is for the abusive parent to acknowledge what they did, apologize to both child and the non-abusive caregiver, and plan a way for the family to move forward together. As with working with adult survivors of trauma, it is very important to have the child understand, and for the therapist to understand, that the child is the expert, and to help them foster a trust in their gut. It's very, very important to help empower the child. Many feel powerless following the domestic violence. So a very important piece of therapy is helping to empower the child. One way to do this is by providing collaborative problem-solving opportunities for the children. So an example of this would be a case that I had where a young girl had been sexually abused by her father when she was a baby, and was now starting to have supervised visitation with her father. She was very worried about the visits, feeling very unsafe, and we worked together to come up with a safety plan for her, what would feel the most comfortable, ways in which she could feel safe in the visit. It was, we actually created a safe word together. It was her idea to pick the word. We did an art project with the word, talked about who to tell it to, how to implement it. And in this way, even though she was walking into an inherently unsafe situation, she did feel more in control. And lastly here, we just have some brief ideas about working with children who are impacted by IPV, very general things that many of you will be familiar with just from even working with people who have no trauma exposure, but just asking the clients what they need. So making sure that you give them options, offer choices, as we've spoken about, which gives control back to the client. It's important to focus on the client's strengths, explore their social supports, and use grounding techniques and relaxation techniques whenever necessary. Sorry, we skipped ahead a little bit there, but this is just a quote that we at STEPS hold very near and dear that we wanted to share with all of you. It says, survivorship is not only the freedom from violence, but also the empowerment of the survivor. So we find that this is an important reminder, especially when safety planning and treatment planning, that healing and survivorship is not just about physical safety, but also emotional safety and empowerment. It is the best way that we know to interrupt the cycle of violence.
So now let's talk a little bit more about the treatment models for children, right? The first thing that I would like to point out or quote is this quote by Alicia Lieberman, who's the developer of the child-parent psychotherapy model. I think it, what happened to the slides? Oh, okay. So, so what she basically says is that the main goal of children's therapy is to support the child's capacity to grow well and love well, express experience and regulate emotion, and recover from dysregulation, explore and learn within society's values, and manage fear and frustration. And so we found this quote very important when guiding our treatment plans with children. I think we can think about all the symptoms that a child is displaying and the history that the child has had, and then if we add that towards this quote and we think about what are the things that we want to achieve with this child, I think that that's what we want to achieve. We want to achieve these ideas of for the child to be able to regulate his emotions, recover from dysregulation, explore his world, learn within society, to grow well and love well, as she would say. So now let's talk a little bit, let's talk a little bit about the child-parent psychotherapy model, which is the model that that Alicia Lieberman actually developed. She's one of the developers. CPP is a dyadic model of intervention for children 0 to 6 and their non-abusive caregivers. CPP purpose is to heal attachment between child and parent, reestablish a sense of safety, and develop child's ability to self-regulate through the caregiver's support. There was a time, so the ideology or the idea behind a session of CPP is that there was a time where the mother or the caregiver was in a very unsafe situation and therefore was unable to keep the child safe. And so what we want to achieve through a CPP session is to communicate to the child that mom is now on a different place or in a different place, and that through CPP we want to help mom be restored as a protective shield. So child can feel more safe to explore the world and also more safe to explore his own emotions and experiences. The goals of CPP are the following. Hopefully this will. So it would be increased safety, both individually and within the dyad, normalize traumatic responses, trauma-informed regressions, and with this point we mean like sometimes children would like go back to bedwetting or some sucking or rocking, and it's important to explain to the parents and to the children that this is a normal response. Encouraging normal development, reliving versus remembering. I think that one of the goals of CPP is also to understand, for the child to be able to retell their story without necessarily reliving all the feelings and all the dysregulation that they experienced in the first time. To be able also to remember at will and not to have the experience just to pop in their memory as in an intrusive way. Another goal would be encourage trust in bodily sensation, achieving reciprocity in intimate relationships, placing trauma experience in perspective. In order to go through all these CPP goals, I think it is very important that we consider to get the caregiver ready to do this job. Therefore, we do a lot of parent support sessions when we're trying to use the CPP model. We want to first explore with the mother or the caregiver all their triggers and all their fears about the child's behavior. And basically, once you are in the session with mother and child, the way the therapist is going to conduct the session to go through all of these goals is to become a sort of narrator between the experiences of the child and the experiences of the mother.
So the next model that we use at STEPS is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT. Many of you may already be familiar with CBT, and this model is quite similar. However, as it clearly states in the title, this is a hybrid model that integrates trauma-sensitive interventions with cognitive behavioral strategies. And if you'll just note, the hyperlink that we included in this presentation is the link to the free TF-CBT training module. If anyone wants to take a look, do the training, the link is on your screen. So the goals of TF-CBT. The first is to reduce the child's negative emotional and behavioral responses to the trauma. So an example of this is, let's say you have a child who, whenever there is a knock on the door, they become very fearful, they're crying, tantruming, highly dysregulated. And the reason for this is that it used to be that the abuser would come over randomly and knock on the door and come into the family home. So now, even though the knock on the door could be a neighbor, it could be a friend, it could be anyone, every time there's a knock, the child becomes highly dysregulated. So using TF-CBT, we can help the child to explore the cognitive triangle, understand where these emotional and behavioral responses are coming from, why they're happening, exploring the worst case scenario, practicing relaxation techniques, and in this way we can reduce the child's emotional and behavioral responses to the trauma. The next is to correct maladaptive or unhelpful beliefs and attributions related to the abusive experience. So, for example, I had a client who, after witnessing his father be physically and verbally and emotionally abusive to his mother, thought 100% that all men were bad, and he was very uncomfortable around men. He would not speak to men, even people that mom said were safe. So one thing that we had to work on was helping the child to correct these maladaptive beliefs. Additionally, as Alejandra mentioned, with TF-CBT and with all the modalities that we use, it's very important to provide support for the non-abusive caregivers and providing them with skills to help them respond optimally to their children and help them through their therapeutic experience. Just for the sake of time, we're not going to go through this slide, but these are the 3 components of TF-CBT practice, and if we have time, we can come back to it later.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about non-directive play therapy. In non-directive play therapy, the child sets the pace and content for the session. We use this approach when we assess that the child requires more freedom and less guidance when processing its trauma, or his or her trauma. The model needs to fit the child's needs and not the other way around. Non-directive play therapy follows the principles of any client-centered trauma-focused intervention. This means that some of these concepts are also used when working with adults. So basically what we want to be focusing when we do non-directive play therapy is to prioritize the connection. Healing happens through connection. It's very important to remember that. To follow the kids' play, but at the same time to have the supplies that might prompt the reenactment in the room. So you want to have some child therapy material that might prompt the experience for the child. You also, in non-directive play therapy, you also want to be tailoring the intervention case by case. So this is like a very sensitive middle way, because we don't want to be trauma avoidant, but we do want to follow the, we don't want to be trauma avoidant, but we do want to follow the child's port of entry, which means that we want to pay attention to their symptoms, their behaviors, their repetitive play, whatever they might be trying to communicate to us, and that would be the way to enter the processing of the trauma. We also don't want to be like facing the child with their trauma history when they're not ready, but we don't want to be colluding with just avoiding talking about it over and over during sessions. Another thing that is helpful to use in non-directive play therapy is the use of animals instead of people, and these would be helpful helpful to establish a safe distance between the child's experience and this animal's experience. So sometimes it's easier for the child to project the trauma into animals without necessarily relating it to his or her own experience. It is important also in non-directive play therapy to do parent support sessions and, again, explore with parents their triggers, prepare the parent for what's going to happen in the session, ask the parent if they're okay about the way we want to proceed in terms of the therapy, and validate them, install hope in them, and empower them.
So just to provide some types of interventions that we use at STEPS, just some ideas briefly. Eagle maps we're going to look at on the next slide, so I'm just going to briefly skip over that. Animal genograms is a great example, as Alejandra said, of using animals in place of people in order to provide some distance. So for example, it would look like sitting down with a child and trying to create a genogram, but using animal figures. So having the child pick what kind of animal would your mommy be and why, and letting them explore their family in that way. You can also task the parent and child to complete something together. So for example, I had a client that loved superheroes, so I created a book where he and his mother could create a superhero together and go through what the powers would be and all of that. We can also have more directed play with dolls. So as Alejandra mentioned, it's important to go with the child's pace. However, if things seem to be slowing down a bit, you can have out the dolls that specifically represent the child's family or something like that. You can tell an IPV story with animals. So again, using animals to provide that safe distance. You can make it very similar to the child's own story. Some will catch on and say that sounds just like my family, and others will just leave it at the animal level, so to speak. You can also create an actual trauma narrative with children. We've done this with children as young as 3, and allow them to create mastery and ownership over their story in that way. And then the intervention that I would say we probably use the most frequently at STEPS are a lot of books, which we will provide you, we'll provide you with the titles of some of them in a few minutes.
So one thing that I wanted to add quickly to what Shoshana said, one of the importance of prepping the parent for this type of intervention is, I'll give you an example of a case that I had where we were playing with this child and his father, and we were reading a book about a raccoon, that we will talk about that book later on, that had a horrible thing happen to him. The book never explains what the horrible thing is, and the character is a raccoon. So that established enough separation and enough safety for the child to be able to hear the story. However, during the telling of the story, the father of this child kept telling him, yeah, you're like the raccoon. Yes, do you see? The raccoon is you. And like so on and so forth. And so half the way through the book, the child just started crying and didn't want to hear anything more about the raccoon and just hugged that, and just we had to pause the book for 2 more sessions. So that's important about preparing the parents about what we're doing before, because you also don't want to be like overstepping within the session. They are the parents and they should be the ones that are in control. Sorry about that.
Right, and here is the My Important People worksheet, and this is something that we do with all children who receive therapy at STEPS. And essentially the way it works is the child writes their name in the middle bubble, and then the names of important people in their life in the bubbles surrounding it. And then they attach each of those bubbles to their own bubble using different types of lines to symbolize the type of relationship they have with this person. And they then color in the bubbles according to a chart that we have that just explains what each color corresponds, the feeling that each color corresponds to. And in this way, we're able to learn a little bit more about the child that we just started working with, but also start to understand some of the family dynamics at play.
So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over this list, but this is basically a recommended books for children that Shoshana was talking about by topic. So you can read here the list and hopefully buy the books and work with them if you feel that they're helpful.
And these are some recommended books for you guys, for providers. The first two books are related to child-parent psychotherapy, CPP. Treating Trauma and Traumatic Grief is the TFCBT book. Dibs in Search of Self, the play therapy book. Working with Children to Heal Interpersonal Trauma, The Healing Power of Play, and Play Therapy with Children and Adolescents in Crisis are also all books for play therapy with children.
And for the animal genogram, if you want to read more about on how to do it, this was something that was developed by Ileana Gill, so you can read in any of her books and you can find more information about that. Here we have some resources for providers. We have the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the website, and the 0 to 3 network that works to ensure that babies and toddlers benefit from the early connections that are critical to their well-being and development. Then we have questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alejandra and Shoshana. We are now getting ready to start our questions and answers section. So we have some questions already, but you can still submit questions through the chat box. One thing I would like to mention is that the slides will be available pretty soon. So they will be available by Thursday. So those of you who are interested in having the information and also having access to the resources that were provided will have them at that point. So one of the questions we had was asking to provide examples of workbooks and resources that could be used with children, and Alejandra and Shoshana had just done this. And the next question is it suggested to have parents sit in each session with the child, even when the parents will not be involved in the session?
So, no, it isn't. I think that at least we at STEPS, if we have children that are 13 and under, we always work with the parent. We believe that the parents should be involved in their treatment. Having said that, they don't need to be involved in every single session. So sometimes, depending on the need and depending on how the therapeutic progress is going, you're going to meet with the parent by himself, or herself, you're going to meet with the child alone, or you're going to meet with both of them. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve through that particular session. Oh, yeah. And for the CPP model, for the child-parent psychotherapy model, the one that is used with children that are 0 to 6, that is a specific model that requires for the parent, the caregiver, and the child to always be seen together, except for the parent support sessions that are conducted only with the parent. So that means that the child is never seen alone, basically, unless there are specific indications. Is there another question? Can you
yes. So we have another question. How do you address emotional abuse going on in the home absent physical abuse?
That's a really great question, and it is often the case of children that we work with at STEPS where there was emotional, verbal, psychological abuse, but there was no physical violence that happened. And it can still definitely be addressed in the same upfront ways in which physical violence is spoken about. So, for example, it can be a matter of talking with the child about exactly what they witnessed in the home. So maybe it was a lot of fighting, a lot of arguing, a lot of one of the parents or someone in the home putting down another parent, and a lot of talk about the ways in which relationships can be healthy and unhealthy, obviously in an age-appropriate way, but helping the child to understand and master what does a healthy relationship look like, what are the reasons why the child is coming to therapy to learn about these things, and helping them to process that type of I guess, an insidious type of abuse where it's not so blatantly obvious to the world. Maybe, you know, teachers haven't gotten involved, ACS hasn't gotten involved, whoever it is, but that it can be just as damaging as physical abuse.
I also think that adding to what Shoshana was saying, it is important to relate for the child some of the behaviors or symptoms that the child might be presenting to their experience at home. So sometimes to make it more real and concrete, especially in CPP, there is a triangle that suggests that we talk to the child about, like, this happened at home, and therefore this is how you started behaving, and this is what we're going to do to support you towards it.
Okay. So we have time for 2 more questions, and the first one is, this participant would like guidance working with children in schools when their child is dysregulated that helps them function while they're in school rather than having them in the timeout room or just medicated.
How old are those children?
Elementary, they say.
Okay. So I think that when a child gets really dysregulated, we need to think about several things. First of all, children often, and I would say all the time, get dysregulated when they are feeling unsafe. So the first step would be to guarantee the child's safety. And when I'm talking about safety, I'm not only talking about their environment, but also their emotional safety in the moment. Like, are they safe with their feelings? Are they, like, are their feelings feeling too overwhelming that they're making them feel so unsafe? So that would be the first step. The second thing that I would think about is there's 2 things that happen when it comes to emotional dysregulation. You would have the body sensation and the body getting dysregulated, and for that you could have a lot of meditation and breathing techniques. Some of the books that are listed really help with that. There's also, we like to do a pizza breathing or a chocolate cake type of breathing where you ask the child to put a slice of pizza in their hands and to close their eyes, smell the pizza, and then blow because the pizza is really, really hot. So before eating it, they want to smell it and then blow to make it less hot. So those are different type of exercises for the body part. For the emotional part, I happen to think that as for adults or for children, emotions, when we try to tuck them in our body, they just gain way more and more strength. So in order to help a child that is having an emotion that is having a lot of strength inside of him, the idea would be to be able to name it and process it and put it out there. Even though it might feel scary in the beginning, the intensity of the emotion will start decreasing.
Okay. So the next question is, what can be done to help youth who are present in a household that has verbal abuse and experience withdrawal of affection from one parent?
So I think much of what we talked about for working with children where there is not physical violence present in the home applies for when there's verbal abuse as well. And a withdrawal of affection, I guess, okay, sorry about that. So for withdrawal of affection, it's important to work with the child on understanding some of the dynamics of intimate partner violence and what might be happening in the home. So is this withdrawal of affection because there is just abuse happening and the parents can only focus on what is happening within their relationship? Is it that one or is it that one parent is frequently not even in the home? So understanding what that withdrawal of affection looks like, and then processing that with the child. Again, as Alejandra said, it's really important to help children learn their feelings and be able to name what is happening for them. So is this child feeling shame? Is this child feeling guilty? Is this child feeling really sad? Is there depression happening? So helping the child to understand what exactly it is that they're feeling, being able to name it, put it out there, and then helping the child to understand, again, the dynamics of IPV and what can happen. And if possible, I'm not sure of the exact case, but if a family session can perhaps be accomplished between the child and the non-abusive caregiver to help that parent understand what the child is feeling and be able to process it in a safe way, and in that way also raising awareness with the non-abusive caregiver of what is happening for that child.
So there is a question that apparently I misunderstood. The question regarding the child dysregulation. The real question was, how can I collaborate with the teachers so they are less reactive when a child is dysregulated? And that would be the last question that we're able to answer. But basically, I would suggest to really become an ally of the child, and which that might mean is like to talk to the teacher, provide tons of psychoeducation on how trauma and IPV can impact a child and a child's behavior and a child's feelings, and normalize the child's behavior, even though it might be very disruptive or might be inconvenient for the teacher, helping the teacher understand that it is a normal behavior, that that also comes from a place of having experienced a lot of really difficult moments, and that in order to help with that behavior, the child is going to need to process his or her traumatic experience, not necessarily be punished for his behavior. So I think that that would be, like, psychoeducation would be a great way to do it. And then maybe also ask the teacher, how can I help you when these things happen? If I'm assuming that you're the school social worker, how can I be of service when these moments of the child getting really dysregulated and become really overwhelming for you? Should I be calling to the classroom? Should I be taking the child? Should I be able to stay with the rest of the classroom students so you can take a moment with the child? Things like that, I would say.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alejandra and Shoshana. Thank you, everyone who attended. Thank you also for your questions. If you have any other questions, you can contact us at ctax.info@nyu.edu. And also, once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you complete that and provide your feedback. Also, we will be providing the contact information of the presenters if you wanted to follow up with them. On behalf of Max Silver, CTAC, and MCTAC, and our presenters, we would like to thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.